Let's speak with John Barnes, former England player. Afternoon to you, John.
Good afternoon. Hi.
I mean, this doesn't have to really be political, does it? These are just facts.
It isn't political at all. And of course, forget about Lloyd and Greene King. There are hundreds and hundreds of corporations and industries and individual people, normal people, who would have benefited from reparations. So in terms of, from a Greene King point of view, you can look at Oxford University, you can look at, and Colston wasn't the only one in Bristol. So, when they found out about certain people in certain institutions or certain companies, but of course the whole fabric of Britain was built on colonialism. Yes, slavery separately as well, but in terms of the amount of people who benefited from that, these people weren't unique. So that is why I say, yes, it's important for us to understand and acknowledge what actually went on. But if we're going to start tearing down statues because of somebody was racially biased or benefited from the slave trade, you're really going to have to be tearing down a lot of England. So for me,
I was going to say that's pretty much everything gone, isn't it? Because I mean, we could talk about statues, but then we get into buildings and street names and
but also
artifacts.
The thing for me, absolutely. But the thing for me is that England would have benefited from that. Colston would have given a lot of money to Bristol. Bristol probably would not have, some of it wouldn't have been built if it wasn't for Colston and other slave traders. So a lot of the wealth coming to this country is not for them. Yes, okay, they would have made a lot of money themselves, but they were benefactors to the country itself. So, the country then has to understand that it's not about these individuals. It's about how the country benefited from it. So, yes, acknowledge it, learn from it, don't deny it actually happened, but let's move forward.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, it's the abolition of slavery. It's almost 200 years ago now. We're into that territory. It doesn't mean to say that the effects of it didn't carry on. And as you rightly point out, John, that many companies at business base were thrived because of money that came from that. I guess some would say, well, we talked about going around this country looking at statues and buildings and institutions. I mean, you could go around the world and we could find nefarious parts of history and all manner of terrible things, whether you're looking at India, Pakistan, parts of Africa. You could look at the United States, Australia, man alive. I mean, the list goes on. We were we weren't that civilized 200 years ago, and people did horrible things to each other.
Of course they were, but of course, as much as slavery may have been abolished 200 years ago, reparations were still being paid up to 10 years ago. Reparations to the people who owned slaves. So let's not be mistaken in that slavery was abolished and then that was it, because the people who owned slaves and companies who benefited from that were still being paid up until 10, 15 years ago. So, it's not as if, it didn't impact even from a financial point of view, slavery on people even up to, the 21st century.
How do you mean, John? I didn't quite follow that. Can you explain that, how people were still being paid?
Because when slavery was abolished and reparations had to be paid to the tune of, I don't know, I think it's about 40 million at the time, the equivalent of probably 200 billion. They didn't get paid all at once. Of course, families and companies and people who owned companies were still being paid up to 20 years ago for the reparations. So, so as much as we're talking about it was abolished, there was still money being paid to people who either were involved in the slave trade or had slaves up to maybe 20 years ago.
But of course, the money that was used to abolish it was also seismic, and that was being paid as well by British taxpayers up till, I think, 5 years ago.
Exactly. But, of course, the people who didn't get reparations were the ones who were enslaved, who were stolen from their land or bought from their land and treated in the way they were actually treated. So reparations went to the enslavers, if you like. But all that being said, the point I'm trying to make is that this is the way the world was. We were just and you have to look at colonialism equally, in fact, even more so in terms of being detrimental to black people in Africa than slavery. Now, if we just want to talk about the ones who get caught, for example, and we look at, obviously, Colston and then, of course, Lloyd's and Greene King, if you investigate, you're going to see many more people. So what do? We just have to move forward, learn from it. Don't deny it. Let's learn why we actually, rather than feeling that the British Empire was altruistic and in terms of civilization and we want to civilize people and make people's lives better, it was about enriching the British Empire by exploiting the rest of the world. Now, this is what everyone wanted to do. Britain wasn't unique. So we're not saying Britain was terrible and everybody else. The whole of Europe wanted to do it. But we in Britain were just better at it. Something we found that we were quite good at globally back then, which is it's not a criticism. What it is an acknowledgement that this is what it was, because we keep believing that we civilized the world. We brought all good things to the world, to Africa and these parts of the world. That is how we have been conditioned to think of ourselves as superior morally and intellectually, whereas that's not the case. And if we understood how we got what we got, where it came from, then we would probably see things differently.
I tell you what slightly disappoints, because I think it's unarguable what you're saying, John. I think most people will be nodding at their radio saying, yeah, I mean, it's stupid to try and sweep this away and say this didn't happen, because it demonstrably did happen. But there's another thing going on, and that's this kind of sense that we've gone into reverse gear on sort of racial harmony. Maybe I'm just viewing this through the prism of protests that we've seen recently. I think back to when you were playing back when you were at Liverpool in the 80s and the 90s, and you were talking about this stuff then. You were probably talking about it before then.
Yes.
But and since then, of course, we know things have moved forward. The Kick Racism Out campaign and all the leaps and bounds that have been made in that time. But in the last month, I'm just sensing a bit of a disappointment. How are you as a black man feeling this? As a white man, I can't walk in your shoes. But what do you sense about where we're at right now in the wider issue?
Well, I was listening to what you're talking about, the Black Lives Matter movement, before I actually came on, literally 30 seconds a minute before I came on. And I agree with you to a certain extent. The waters are getting muddied by lots of different people wanting different things, which really, for me, you can look at George Floyd, you can look at statues, you can look at everything. But for me, what we should be focusing on is exactly what Marcus Rashford has done. The treatment, and of course, Marcus Rashford's situation is not a black or white situation. It's a situation for the disadvantaged people in the inner cities, who are disproportionately black in terms of the amount of black people are in relation to white people. But if you then start to talk about the disenfranchisement and inequality in the inner cities in terms of jobs, education, housing, that for me is something that we can focus on. And if you can see what Marcus Rashford achieved in 3 days, albeit for the inner cities rather than any black specific directive, if a lot of the elite black people, sportsmen, actors were to then look at the knife crime, look at the situations within the black community, within the inner cities, and do what Marcus Rashford did, then you can see a tangible difference. But unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 5-10 years is an elite group of people talking about we do need more black managers and black actors getting Oscars and black singers, so we do need that. But I think it's very much like the debate on Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. All lives, of course, does matter, but at this moment in time, what is more urgent and is more concerning is the situation with Black Lives Matter, and that's not about just the police, it's about other different things. So when people criticize me for saying that I'm protecting football or saying it's not important, it is important, but what's overwhelmingly more important, which is what Marcus Rashford has said, is the situation that we have in our inner cities for our young black kids, and that is what the people with the platform and the people with the voice. Look at Marcus Rashford. Imagine if Raheem Sterling, Idris Elba, people started talking about, instead of we need more black Oscars and black managers and black people in the boardroom, if they were to talk about things that Marcus Rashford talks about, they can really make a difference to the majority of black people's lives.
It's interesting. Raheem Sterling was saying about a week ago that there's 30% of something like 30%, a third of players out of 500 pro players in the leagues are black. That's huge, of course, in terms of proportionality. Do you have any idea, John, what it was when you were playing back in the early 80s? What percentage that would have been?
Well, it's interesting when we talk about because very much like the whole historical aspect of historical amnesia when we're talking about slavery and colonialism. Very similar in football. I mean, I've heard Gareth, and I love Gareth. And Gareth talks about the new diverse England team. I played for England in 1984 with Luther Griffith, Ricky Hill, Brian Stein, me, Mitchell Thomas, Cyril Regis, Danny Thomas. That's already 7 in the squad.
Yeah.
Considered to be quite a diverse England team in 1983, but we're trying to pretend that this is the first time this has actually happened.
That's amazing when you list those names.
If you just keep doing that, saying that, this is a new time whereby people are now going to be more equal. This has been happening for years and years and years, and we've not got anywhere. But if we just keep denying that it's happened before and it's failed before, we will then convince ourselves that this is a new dawn. And that's what people are thinking. People are saying, this feels different. This is not the first time this movement has happened. It's changed the name. It may have been obviously more media attentive. But from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement to the riots in Brixton, the riots in Tuxteth, this has happened before and nothing has changed. So we really then have to not stop thinking that this is definitely going to change now because this feels different.